Welcome back to MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic. Welcome back to EDH Commander Thursday, and in our last video, I tasked the MTG Burgeoning community with selecting a commander around which we would build right here on the channel. Who did the MTG Burgeoning community select? We are about to find out. Hello fans of MTG Burgeoning, and welcome back to another EDH Commander Thursday video. We are about to unveil the community's selection of the general around whom we will build our next EDH deck. And without any further ado, the winner is Lazoff, Dimir Mastermind. Lazoff is a legendary shapeshifter for 2 blue and 2 black. It's 3/3 with hexproof. Whenever a creature is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, we may have Lazoff, Dimir Mastermind, become a copy of that card, except its name is still Lazoff. It's legendary in addition to its other types. It gains hexproof and this ability. So we are going to build around Lazoff a mill deck focusing on getting cards from our opponent's hand, library, and battlefield right into the graveyard in order for Lazoff to become a copy of those creatures, and we can ensure victory through lethal commander damage. As such, the first 12 cards that we are going to add to this deck are going to focus primarily on global opponent graveyard thickening. Oh, I like that. Global opponent graveyard thickening. A little GOGT. Had to work on some acronyms for that. Somebody help me out in the comments section below. Be a good sport. So, the first 12 cards are going to be completely focused on getting multiple opponents at the same time, filling their graveyards as best we can in order to trigger Lazoff and find the best creature we can to swing in for those lethal commander points of damage. So, let's begin. Card number 1 of our Mill Lazoff build is going to be Altar of the Brood. It's an artifact for 1, and whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under our control, each opponent puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. Play a land, they each mill 1. Crack a fetch. After we play a fetch, each opponent mills 2. Play some more spells, permanents go into play, opponents mill X. So Altar of the Brood in the early game is definitely going to help to get some cards into the graveyard so that we can have Lazoff become copies of whichever cards we choose. That's card number 1. Number 2, Ruin Crab. For 1 blue, we have an 0/3 crab with the landfall mechanic. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, each opponent will mill 3 cards. So again, the focus of these first 12 cards are going to be our opponents, not target opponents, not an opponent, not target player. We are looking for our opponents. Card number 3, we are going to include a copy of Maddening Cacophony. It's a sorcery for 1 and a blue that reads each opponent mills 8 cards. However, if we pay the kicker cost of this spell and make this spell 4 and 2 blue, then instead each opponent mills half their library, rounded up. So this is a spell that's much better than Traumatize, which picks target player to put half of their library right into the graveyard. If we pay 1 more colorless mana, as opposed to Traumatize's 3 and 2 blue, we hit each opponent for more than half their library. Maddening Cacophony could end up seriously being a win condition in this deck, and that will be card number 3. Card number 4, we are going to play with a copy of Folio of Fancies. It's an artifact for 1 and a blue. It reads that players have no maximum hand size. Now, initially, this is something that I generally would eschew because I do not like to play with cards that have any kind of positive effects on the opponents in any way. I do not want to allow my opponents to have a free Reliquary Tower or in play, or a free Thought Vessel, or something that allows them to not have to discard down to 7, particularly if they're trying to draw a ton of cards each turn. However, what Folio of Fancies does seems to fit what we want to do in this deck. So let's continue. We can tap 2X and tap Folio of Fancies, and then each player draws X cards, and I can probably let you know that I most likely will never utilize that ability, because I am not going to put cards in my opponent's hands. However, that last ability down there, 2 and a blue, tap Folio of Fancies, each opponent puts a number of cards equal to the number of cards in their hand from the top of their library into their graveyards. So maybe at some point the no maximum hand size could come back to haunt the player who's trying to abuse that ability. But for 2 and a blue and turning this artifact sideways, it will allow us to have each opponent mill a specific number of cards right into their graveyard. And that's what we're trying to focus on with the first 12 cards in this Lazoff mill deck. All right, card number 5. We have hit the 1/3 of the way mark. Next card up, we are going to play with a copy of Manic Scribe, and we're going back to SOI. You know what that means, MTG Burgeoning fans. Shadows over Innistrad, one of my all-time favorite sets. For 1 and a blue, we have a 0/3 human wizard. And when Manic Scribe enters the battlefield, each opponent puts the top 3 cards of their library into the graveyard. However, with the Delirium mechanic, at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if there are 4 more card types among cards in our graveyard, that player puts the top 3 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So as long as we hit that Delirium trigger at the beginning of each one of our opponent's upkeep, they are going to mill the top 3 cards. It should not be difficult to achieve Delirium in this mill deck. So Manic Scribe is card number 5. All right, number 6. We are going to toss in a wonderful little artifact called Mind Crank. For 2 colorless, whenever an opponent loses life, that player puts that many cards from the top of his or her library into their graveyard, otherwise known as Mill X, where X is the amount of life lost by that opponent this turn. Mind Crank is a ridiculously sneaky good card, and we can consider this a potential win condition as we move closer to the completion of this Dex 99. All right, that is the halfway point. We've got 6 cards left, and the next card we're going to include, we're going to Kaldheim, and that's going to be for a copy of King Narfi's Betrayal. 1 blue and a black, each player mills 4 cards. Then we may exile a creature or planeswalker card from each graveyard until end of, and that's for lore counter number 1. So when this ETBs, we put that lore counter on, and then each player mills 4 cards. Now, I know earlier I said that we were focusing on opponents having the mill. Well, the opponents are doing the milling, but we're going to add 4 cards as well, because there may be something that we want to get from our graveyard right into play, and you're going to see how we can do that very soon. So that's lore counter number 1. Now for lore counter number 2 and number 3, until end of turn, we may cast spells from among cards exiled with King Narfi's Betrayal, and we may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast those spells. So we can hit King Narfi's Betrayal, each player mills those cards, we could potentially have Lazoff become one of those creatures at our opponent's mill, and then we can choose to exile that same creature, and then we can cast it later during lore counter number 2 or lore counter number 3. So King Narfi's Betrayal gives us a little bit more versatility than just milling into the graveyard and having Lazoff shapeshift. All right, next up we have card number 8, and we're staying on the trend of enchantments, but we're not going back to a saga. We're going for Psychic Corrosion. 2 and a blue, whenever we draw a card, each opponent mills the top 2 cards of their library. Very simple. We draw a card during our turn, each opponent mills 2. We cast something that draws 3 cards, each opponent mills 6. Psychic Corrosion is going to be one of those cards that sits out there on the graveyard, that sits out there on the battlefield, that our opponents are just going to look at and say, meh, meh, meh. But each time we draw a card and 2 more cards go into the graveyard, that's just more opportunities for Lazoff to find something that's going to stick, and it's going to be game over real quick. Another enchantment, and we still are not done with our enchantments, folks. We are moving to card number 9, and that's going to be Memory Erosion. 1 and 2 blue. Whenever an opponent plays a spell, that player puts the top 2 cards of their library into his or her graveyard. So again, we're trying to, have a little bit of a little mill here, a little mill there. We don't necessarily have to have every spell as devastatingly powerful as Maddening Cacophony, because these little incremental millings are going to eventually catch up, because it's going to be at some point in time that Lazoff is going to find a creature that he really, really likes. And once he becomes a copy of that creature, the game is most likely going to be over, because he can't protect himself with Hexproof. And we will have other ways in which to protect Lazoff too as we move further in this deck building series. And another part to kind of point out when we focus on these 12 cards that are dealing with each opponent, it's much more valuable to focus our resources on spells that say each opponent, because you never know exactly who's going to sit down at the commander table. If somebody sits down and they're pulling out an Izzet spell deck, Lazoff is going to suffer there, because they're not going to have a ton of creatures. So we want to make sure that these spells can hit as many or all the opponents at the table as we can possibly can, and then we just pick the best option. All right, and here we go. Card number 10, and the last enchantment of this first dozen. We're going to play with a copy of Court of Cunning. 1 and 2 blue. When Court of Cunning ETBs, we become the monarch. At the beginning of our upkeep, any number of target players each mill 2 cards, which, for the purposes of this deck, will be X, where X is equal to the number of opponents we have. However, if we are the monarch, each of those players will mill 10 cards instead. So when we cast Court of Cunning, let's make sure that we can hold on to that monarch, because having each opponent mill 10 cards at the beginning of our upkeep, this, in effect, could potentially become a win condition card, even in the absence of Lazoff on the battlefield. All right, 2 cards left. And card number 11, we are going to include a copy of Consuming Aberration. It's a horror. 3 blue and a black, and its power and toughness are equal to the number of cards in our opponent's graveyards. Whenever we cast a spell, each opponent reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a land card, then puts those cards into the graveyard. So again, we have a spell here that also doubles as a creature, and it allows our opponents to fill their graveyards each time that we cast a spell. Plus, with the massive power and toughness that Consuming Aberration could get to, we could look to the potential of having Consuming Aberration one-shot an opponent. Now, it doesn't have any evasion. However, I do sense that we're going to include some equipment that will provide some evasion later on during this deck building series. All right, we have 1 card left. This is card number 12 of this first installment of Building Around Mill Lazoff, and that's going to be a copy of Mind Grind. X blue and a black, each opponent reveals cards from the top of their library until he or she reveals X land cards, then puts all cards revealed this way into their graveyard. This is an amazing card, and as long as our opponents are not playing with any shuffle effects like any of the Eldrazi Titans or a Blightsteel Colossus or anything that's going to get their library or to get their graveyard back into their library, we could potentially, with enough mana, look at Mind Grind as being another win condition. Even if we can't get X to be high enough, still, Mind Grind is a fantastic sorcery to help Lazoff find a creature that he deems most worthy. All right, MTG Burgeoning community, the first 12 cards have been laid forth. Leave me suggestions in the comment section below as to what cards should come next. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things Magic.